Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Phil Mackintosh, chief economist at Nasdaq, to discuss the most important thing traders are watching this afternoon. And of course, that's resolution on a stimulus package. And Phil, we can see just how sensitive the markets are to any sort of breakdown or any sort of conversation around a stimulus deal being reached.
Yeah, I mean, you saw the sell-off yesterday afternoon when it looked like we were going to run out of time, and then we've had a little bounce this morning because it seems like there's still talks going on. And I mean, it makes sense because if a stimulus happens, it's going to be trillions of dollars, which is going to be a huge boost to retail spending. We've already seen that from the first stimulus. It's going to help people at least muddle through, even if it doesn't create jobs. So it's going to be a big deal for the economy and a big deal for a lot of companies. And the unemployment rate. So it makes sense that it's the thing that's driving the markets along with the election. But there's a lot of uncertainty, clearly, because we're getting close to the election. And I'm sure the politicians have got better things to worry about right now with 2 weeks to go than trying to all agree on how to get a stimulus bill done.
All right. And speaking of the election, if we take a look at our first chart for the day with our friends at Predictit, shows that there's a pretty substantial win rate for Biden.
Yeah, but not overwhelming considering we've only got 2 weeks to go. It's, it sort of picked up at the end of September, which is right about when Trump caught COVID. But it's kind of held steady at that sort of 64% rate. And it hasn't really picked up or ticked down. So, it looks like a pretty safe bet right now, but it's definitely not done and dusted, so they'd say.
Yeah, well, we saw that last election, that's for sure, which is why it's important everybody gets out to vote. And taking a look at our next slide here, we're looking at some U.S. net farm income data.
Yeah, and the reason that I put that in is actually some of the polling statistics show that the farmers are overwhelmingly pro-Trump and planning to stay voting for him, about 75% of them. So it's one of those constituents that is definitely benefited from Trump. That's what this chart shows, is a lot of their income this year has actually come from government payments rather than real income from actually selling their agriculture. But it sort of highlights that there are pockets of the economy that have benefited from a lot of the Republican policies, and they actually do feel like we're better off now than 4 years ago. So they're planning to vote Trump.
And if we look at our next couple of charts here with some COVID-19 data, it really is, if you look at the chart on the left, the EU spike has been pretty astounding, whereas Asia ex-India has done a really good job.
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting about this chart, rather than the fact that Europe has caught up and passed America, which is pretty astounding considering it sounds like they've had better mask compliance. It sounds like they've had mostly better testing, and all sorts of approaches have been more sensible than what we've seen in the Americas. The Asian response is overwhelmingly better. I mean, the bumps that they've seen are really small dots compared to what the US and European region have seen in terms of cases per million people. And so you can see that reflected in the death rates as well. Much lower deaths per million people. And even though the second wave of cases is not causing such a big spike in deaths in the US or in Europe, although Europe is starting to see an increase, Asia, basically by shutting down their borders and by testing people that are coming into each of the countries, they've kind of managed to save a lot of the travel-induced COVID spread that a lot of the countries, and especially Europe, arguably that's one of the reasons they've seen the spread, is they opened up their borders for the summer so everybody could go on their vacations, and now everyone's back. It seems to be spreading again, and arguably that's what our first wave was, with a lot of people coming back from overseas. With COVID, you didn't know it was there because you weren't testing it, and it spreads quicker than people realize. And before you know it, you have got that exponential growth curve. Asia has done a great job of stopping that from happening, clearly in the data. And in the last chart, you've got, it kind of shows the difference in their approach. Maybe it's not so much mask wearing, but it's just closing things down and creating a bubble regionally or even locally, so that you can tackle COVID in a more isolated and specific and focused way.
Well, what's so interesting is when you look at the travel restrictions as of September 2020, of course, just yesterday we learned that over 1 million Americans traveled through U.S. airports. And I think the concern is, as you had mentioned before, when Europe had opened its borders for summer holiday in August, what happens when you have college students that are coming back and forth from university to home, and then from home back to university? They're going to be traveling for Thanksgiving and for winter break.
Yes, they are. And I think, it's one of the big risks, isn't it? Is we know that the colleges have actually had a lot of COVID cases, and as those students, if they come home and there's big family gatherings, it'll be cold, so they'll mostly be indoors. We know that that's one of the risk factors for spreading, and we talked yesterday about the super spreader that might have started from Sturgis. When we don't see the spike for another 3 or 4 weeks, but it definitely seems like it's related to these events where people get together and get close and have drinking and food and lots of talking is a high risk activity.
All right, Phil, thanks for joining us on Trade Talks.
You're welcome, Jill.
And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.